Thank you for listening to The Path to Authenticity. My name's Tom Gentry. I think of this show as the opposite of small talk. You'll hear real conversations with real people who know who they are. We talk about what makes them who they are, how they became who they are, and how we might become truer expressions of who we are.
I'm Tanner Campbell, and this is The Path to Authenticity.
If this is your first time here, thanks for checking it out. If not, thanks for coming back. I'm Tom Gentry, and this is The Path to Authenticity, Season 2. It's the first of 2 episodes featuring Tanner Campbell, who's an author, a podcaster, and an expert on Stoicism. He talks about the process of publishing his book, Stoicism But Brief, how he came to do the Practical Stoicism podcast. And it's a topic that I've been interested in because it's something I hear an awful lot about these days, especially in regard to men and our relationships with our emotions. So when I found out that Tanner was doing this book, I wanted to reconnect with him. He was on the podcast a while back, so I think you're going to enjoy it. Made some changes with the music for Season 2, updated the artwork a little bit, got some great interviews coming up. Keep an eye on Clubhouse, where I'll be doing a lot of those interviews live. And you can catch part 2 of this conversation next week.
Emerge from slumber.
I saw that you have written this book, and I saw that you were on Substack, and that's a place where I've been spending a lot of time. I have a Substack publication and launched a little podcast there myself. And, I wanted to have a conversation with you and hear about the book, hear, why Stoicism and what led you to, first of all, be interested in Stoicism, and secondly, to write a book about it. But off the top, why don't you tell people what you do?
So I'm an American philosopher who focuses specifically on Stoicism exclusively. I'm a non-academic philosopher, meaning I do not work with inside academia. I do not have a PhD. I like to make that very clear right at the outset for anybody who might make that assumption. And I have a very popular podcast called Practical Stoicism. It gets about 500,000 downloads a month. And is focused entirely on that subject matter. And the reason I created it, there are some misconceptions about what Stoicism is. A lot of people think it's the repression of emotion. A lot of people think it's, be a lone wolf. You don't need to have any friends or friendships or relationships whatsoever. Love is anti-Stoic, which couldn't be further from the case. And it completely throws out the ideas of role ethics and the cosmopolis, which suggests at least that we need to care about the world city, which is, I don't know everyone. And I started the podcast because I was drifting from my own practice. I had survived the pandemic by the skin of my teeth, lost a car in a repossession, lost my studio business, couldn't survive, was very, very lucky to transition what I was doing at the time, online teaching of audio engineering and podcast production, to virtual so that I could sell courses online. But it was close. And in the years I was stressed out about losing the business, so 2020 to 2021, pretty much, I guess, or maybe a little bit of 2019 as well, I wasn't practicing Stoicism. And I had first found it back in 2014-15 as an atheist, and kind of kept it at arm's length because I did see the practical uses of it, but there was a lot of God talk and spirituality talk and, things like providence and things that just made me uncomfortable as an atheist at the time. And I didn't really mature my relationship with it until 2017, 2018. And then we came into the pandemic, so I distanced myself from it again because I was too stressed out and dealing with too many things. And then when I moved from Maine after the failure of my recording studio, I shouldn't say failure. I mean, it was a success for a long time, but a lot of people didn't survive the pandemic. Sometimes that's more literal than just talking about the business. In my case, I was fortunate. It was just the business that didn't make it. And I relocated to Denver, Colorado. And when I got here, I had an online business of course creation and audio engineering and such, but I was more stressed out than I'd ever been. I felt unlike myself. I felt like the previous 3 years from there had just been, like a hellscape of bad scenarios and poor luck. And I was feeling sorry for myself. And I thought, I haven't really been practicing the thing that I've been thinking is my default life philosophy, right? I've kind of thought of myself since finding Stoicism as being kind of inherently stoic in a poor definition of the word because I didn't truly understand it when I first found it. And I thought, what I need to do is probably get back to that. And being a podcaster and somebody who's philosophically minded anyway, I thought the best way to do that was to create a once a week podcast on Stoicism, which I did because it forced me to read the text and share it with other people and try to work through it. And in Stoicism, there's a practice called prosake, which essentially means the act of paying attention or the practice of paying attention. And the reason it's so useful in Stoicism is that if you are reading the text and trying to decipher the text and trying to implement the text, then you are living a Stoic lifestyle. So it's really the only way to be a Stoic is to practice it, is to practice paying attention to it. So creating a podcast every week was really helpful for me doing that. And I began to feel a lot more comfortable, a lot more like myself. And then something wholly unexpected happened. I'd had a number of podcasts before, ranging from mythology and folklore to atheism, long-form discussions and interviews, some of which had been fairly successful. But none of them were as successful as this podcast became for no reason. I just got very, very lucky. And one day I woke up and the latest episode had 10,000 listens and it had only been like a month. And I thought, okay, well, that's cool. I can't quit my job or anything because you probably know this, Tom. Monetizing a podcast is not something you can do until you have a high number of followers, especially if you're going to do it through ad revenue, which is really the only way to monetize a show like what I was creating. And so I thought, great, I'm going to keep doing it because that's wonderful. I'm glad so many people are getting things out of it. But it's, I can't quit my quote unquote day job. And I didn't really want to. It wasn't my intent to become a full-time philosopher. That was never my goal. And then fast forward a few months, and now it's something like 100,000 downloads a month. And then it's 200. And then I get approached at one of our yearly conferences, Podcast Movement, by a company called Glassbox, who's a podcast network. And they said, we'd love to bring you on to be part of the network. And I thought, wow, you mean I get to do philosophy and Stoicism as a job? That sounds like it's going to be pretty cool. I'll try that. And that's what I did. And then from then, since that's last October to now, I've been doing it full time. And when that happened, it occurred to me that I didn't know enough to be in the very advantageous position that I was in, not financially speaking, but as far as, we had hundreds of thousands of people listening every month. And that meant if I had a misunderstanding of Stoicism at that point, it meant that I was going to proliferate that misunderstanding to hundreds of thousands of people. And so I got this kind of really nervous feeling that, man, I didn't start this as a professional philosopher addressing these issues and talking through this in a very academic sense. That was not my intention. I'm going to get myself in trouble here if I don't bone up, so to speak. And I felt that I had the responsibility to do that. And so hired a couple of mentors, attended the College of Stoic Philosophers, and really started to learn what Stoicism really was beyond like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, which are the two probably most popular names that people would come across when first exploring Stoicism.
Okay. So how's the network thing working for you? So it's a full-time job now. They're just paying you to do it?
Correct. Yeah, I'm not allowed to talk too much about the specifics. I think contractually I can't share too much, but I'm paid a minimum amount a month. And then there is a percentage split in my favor of ad revenue that comes through the show. So if I have an ad that pays me $1 million, which I've never had, someday, fingers crossed, maybe, the network will get X percent and I will get X percent, and I get the larger percent of that share.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, it's something that you want to do with your time, and you're at least afforded the ability to live on it day to day.
Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of spaghetti dinners, but and I think everybody will probably know what I mean by that. But yes, it's the only job I need to have, but I will say it's not the most financially stable job I've ever had, but we're getting there. It's only been, I feel it's hard to speak negatively about it because I've only been doing this podcast since January of last year. So it's barely over a year old. And I know how hard it is to find success in podcasting at all. So to have found the success that I have found as quickly as I have, and by accident on top of that, I really have no room to complain at all.
Well, I love that you pursued this as a way to be fed, in terms of your own well-being. I think that's awesome. But I have a hard time accepting it when I hear you say by accident, because I've watched you kind of casually since we met on Clubhouse. I guess it would have been early in the spring of 2021. I've interviewed you. I've sort of followed what you're posting and some of your podcast stuff. This podcast you're talking about, the artwork is beautiful. And it's emblematic to me of the way that you do things. And so, yeah, maybe there's some luck involved. I think probably the fact that it is a little bit of a hot topic right now. We're at a time in our culture where guys are looking for a lot of direction, and a lot of guys are looking towards Stoicism.
Yes. And unfortunately, a lot of guys are taking advantage of those lot of guys who are looking for direction and directing them in some, in my opinion, fairly poor directions, taking advantage, really.
So tell me how the idea of doing the book came about.
Well, like I said, in October, I realized the position I was in from a point of view of responsibility. I had to know more. I had to be more informed because people were now trusting me as maybe not the sole. I'd be thinking very much of myself to think I was the only Stoic content that anyone was consuming, and I don't. But I was one of the sources that people were getting their information from. And that meant that if I wasn't correct, or as correct within a margin of error as I could be, then I was going to be causing a problem. I was going to be doing less good than I wanted to do, or having less benefit anyway. And I enrolled in the College of Stoic Philosophers, and I started reading, and I took on a couple of mentors, Kai Whiting, who is in fact my co-author on both of the books that we're working on. And it became apparent to me very quickly just how shallow the readings that I had had up to that point were. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's letters, they have some good actionable takeaways in them, and there is a deeper way to read those authors. So I don't want to make it sound like what I got out of it at the time was all one could get out of it, but there was a way to read both of those authors that was shallow, and it is how I had, maybe a little bit deeper than most people would go, but I was still missing a lot. And come, let's say, a few months later, 3, 4, 5 months later, when it really dawned on me how much I had learned, because my mentor said, you are in a position now that you could mentor if you wanted to, which I said I did that once, and I just did not enjoy the experience of, I felt too I felt too responsible for the individual I had on the call. And so I was like, I don't think coaching and mentoring is necessarily for me. And I still felt a little bit like, I mean, it's nice that Kai Whiting, who has a PhD and is an academic, thinks that of me. But I didn't think that of myself enough to do it. And I'm a little bit more comfortable with it now, but I still don't think I'll ever do mentorship, in a formal one-on-one capacity. Anyway, as I became more knowledgeable and I started to realize how much I had missed, I thought, man, if I'm missing this, and I spent a year almost talking about it every weekend, I wonder how many other people are missing as much as I was missing, or way more than I was missing. And then I started to look across, let's call it the diaspora of Stoicism, and I started to notice some pretty big problems, right? We had Broicism, which is like this repress your emotion. You can use Stoicism to get a hot girl. I don't think Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, Musonius Rufus, or anybody Zeno ever said anything like that. So there's like that brand of Stoicism, which is not Stoicism. Then there's $S Stoicism or Silicon Valley Stoicism, which is, it has its place, and I don't necessarily think it's harmful, but it's like Stoicism for the boardroom. How can I push through the fact that, how can I intellectually set myself up, or mentally, psychologically set myself up, that I'm going to ignore the fact that I'm working 80 hours a week for almost no money, because that's just what you got to do in Silicon Valley, baby. You got to grind, rise and grind, that kind of thing. Yeah. And I imagine to some extent that can be useful in a way. Ultimately, I think it probably causes a lot of self-harm, burnout especially. And I didn't see anybody talking about Stoicism as I had come to understand it, capital S Stoicism. Nobody was talking about the physics. Nobody was talking about the cosmology. Nobody was talking about the logic. Everyone was talking about the ethics, but not very deeply. And that's, Ryan Holiday is probably the most well-known writer and podcaster on Stoicism. But his podcast isn't really about Stoicism with a full view. It's a very narrow, almost more like a life hack product than it is a life philosophy, which borders very closely on being, it's not religious. It doesn't meet that definition, because the God in Stoicism is not anything like any God anyone is thinking of when I say that word. There's no personalization to it. In fact, it's looked at as the entire universe, so it's more pantheistic than anything. But his view is so narrow and life hacky, and everything I looked at was narrow in one way or another. And I was like, man, there's so much more to this philosophy, and very few people are talking about it outside of academics. And one of the academics are great. I have many who are my friends, Kai Whiting being one of them, but they are boring. And they don't write for the general public. In fact, sometimes it can be hard for academia to get out of the ivory tower and write in the streets for normal people with normal vocabularies. I should be saying normative people with normative vocabularies, from blue-collar jobs, white-collar jobs even, people who aren't PhDs. And then the other problem is that when academics write books, they go through academic presses, and academic presses charge like, $60, $70, $80, $90, $100. One of my more favorite academics is a woman named Margaret Graver, and she just released a new book. She wrote a great book a while ago actually, called Stoicism and Emotions. Stoicism and Emotion. And if you think that emotion has nothing to do with Stoicism, well, Margaret Graver wrote a book that's like in 10-point font, and it's 300 pages long, right? So clearly emotion exists in Stoicism. And she just released a new one. I can't wait to read it, but it's $100. And I can tell you that, the average high school graduate without a college degree, or maybe even the average bachelor or associate's degree person who isn't tuned to academic language is not going to find that book accessible. And depending on what they do for a living, spending $100 on a book of leisure, a leisure interest, is not something most people can afford to do. So I saw an opportunity to serve, who I used to be, and be something that I wish had been there for me, which is, I think, often how entrepreneurs and, let's say, life coaches, although, again, I don't consider myself that. I think that's how they arrive at the thing they're going to create for others, is that they're things that they struggled with. And that was very true of me in this case. And so I thought, well, Kai and I are working on this other book that is going to take a year to write it. And I have ADHD, and I'm very all about getting things done as quickly as possible. Right. And I'm like, okay, I can spend a year on this other 60, 70,000 word book, but I can't wait that long to publish a book on this topic because I feel like we need to put it out now. And so Kai and I got together and said, okay, well, what if we did 20,000, and what if we called it Stoicism, but brief? And we tried to hit everything: the physics, the logic, cosmology, the ethics. We gave examples. We talked about the dichotomy of control. We talked about different aspects of Stoicism. We said, here's a book that's less than 200 pages long, less than 20,000 words, and it is going to give you the most accurate, accessible, and brief snapshot of Stoicism so that you can decide quickly if this is for you or if it's not. Because if it's for you, dude, I want you to get into it. Like, I want you to change your life based on this philosophy. And if it's not, and that's okay, it doesn't have to, it's not the answer for everybody. Somebody else might prefer Buddhism or Neoplatonism or, some other ism that works better for them, that they more align with. But, and I want you to figure that out quickly too, so that you can move on to whatever that thing is and stop wasting your time and get to work on the most important thing, the only important thing in Stoicism, which is developing virtue, developing a good character. And I don't care what philosophy you use to do that, but if it's Stoicism, I want you to find out it's for you now. And if it's not, I want you to skip over Stoicism and go to the next thing. So that was the motivation for the book.
Well, I love that you want to write something that's accessible.
The reason that I feel so strongly about that is that I am a high school dropout. I am a college dropout. And I find myself to be in a very fortunate position that I have let's call it a natural disposition, that I enjoy reading, and that I felt compelled as an individual, for whatever reason, to educate myself. And I had the time to do that. And I had the ability, in whatever that means, I had the ability to do that. But I know other people like me who dropped out of high school and never got out of Lake Worth, Florida, right? And they can't read Margaret Graver's work. They're not going to be interested in it. It's not going to speak to them. It's not going to seem like it's for them. It's going to seem condescending in ways that, not necessarily intentionally, but they might perceive it that way, and that's a big problem. So I think one of the reasons accessibility was so important to me is that because I know that your normative person I was that person. I was the normative high school dropout, and I had all the baggage that usually comes with that. And I was lucky enough to somehow get out of that situation, but I know that most people aren't. And if we expect, the average conservative and the average liberal and the average centrist to take on a more philosophically fueled, informed worldview, we've got to give them something that doesn't take a particular political slant and judge someone. And we've got to write it in language that is, that is clearly for them and plain language for that reason.
Yeah, I love that. The first thing you're taught as a writer is to know your audience and cater to it. And where I'm at, I'm doing a lot of writing about men and emotions, and so much of what you see out there, they're using language that in no way is going to appeal to a guy. And a lot of that is because the people who are writing all these books in the helping professions, most of them are women. So they're using language and the best example that I can think of that I hear about all the time is vulnerability. Brené Brown, back in 2010, she had done all this research and did this TED Talk that went viral. She did research on shame. And what she talked about is that in order to have the type of connection that you want with another human being, You have to be willing to be seen, and that requires enduring some measure of vulnerability. So you see where that's a lot different than be vulnerable. But that's what everybody says, be vulnerable. You got to be vulnerable. But nonetheless, the guy at the factory a mile from me doesn't want to hear about being vulnerable, And what we're really asking of people when we say that is to demonstrate the courage to be real. That's what it's about. But nobody's saying that. So that's kind of where I want to come in and do the same sort of approach that you are with Stoicism, only with men and emotions, because I think it's one of those things nobody's really talking about, which I think is kind of a good segue into sort of where I wanted to take this conversation. I was listening to a podcast a few weeks back. And first of all, I hear you got to be stoic. I hear stoicism invoked all the time on social media as it pertains to men and emotions all the time. And there's this book. It's called Permission to Feel. It's written by this guy, Mark Brackett, who is the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, founding director. And he sort of stumbled upon this through life experience because he needed to learn all this stuff. But one of the things he talked about is that a lot of people sort of say they're practicing stoicism, but really what they're doing is suppressing their emotions. And so I wanted to kind of hear your take on that. And you've already mentioned what you called it, broicism, right? So I know you address this in your book, but what's the Reader's Digest on emotions as it's seen in Stoicism?
Oh man, that is okay. Let's see how I can do on that. So in Stoicism, there's the idea that most emotions, not all, and there's an important distinction drawn between, for example, let's say your friend is going to play a practical joke on you, and so they've hidden around the corner, and you walk by and they jump out and they scare you, and you feel fear. That is not the kind of emotion that can be controlled as far as the Stoics are concerned, right? Not fear specifically, but that's sort of this primal thing that happens when someone jumps out and screams boo. We're not suggesting, Stoics don't suggest that you can get to a point where someone jumps out and says boo and you say boo hoo. That's not what Stoicism is all about. Instead, what Stoicism says in relation to emotion is that emotions are, excluding those things the sort I just talked about, emotions are things that you arrive at because you have made an intellectual decision about something that's going on. So, for example, taking that same scenario, if you continued to be scared after you realized it was your friend and they were, just playing a joke on you, that would be an emotion that seemed illogical to have from a Stoic perspective, right? Once you realize it's your friend, once you realize it's a joke, you're no longer scared. You might, however, at that point, make a decision about being angry. You might say, it's not nice that they just did that to me. I don't like that they disrespected me, and I think it's a bad thing. And through that reasoning, you assent, A-S-S-E-N-T, you assent to the opinion that being mad is the correct emotion. And so you arrive at your emotions through logical reasoning. Again, excluding those kind of primal emotions. So Stoicism can often be confused for lowercase s Stoicism. So when we spell Stoicism in the book, there's actually a chapter that we tell the reader at the outset. It's going to be a little confusing because when we spell with a capital S, we're talking about Stoicism, the virtue ethics philosophy. When we spell with a small s, we're talking about just, ignoring your emotions, which has its place. We say in the book, I think if you're a combat medic, there's a degree of small s Stoicism that would be quite beneficial for you. because you can't you can't really practice capital S Stoicism while bullets are flying over your head and you're mending someone's flayed open body or something. That requires maybe small S Stoicism. So it's not completely bad, but mostly what the non-initiated would talk about when they were saying Stoicism is that they would say, well, you're not supposed to have emotions. And so when we think of the words Stoic, we think of this kind of like a somber judge character. I think that's what most people think of when they think of, oh, he's very stoic. Oh, so he's like a judge or something, or she's like an attorney or something like that. Someone with no sense of humor and is always very serious. And the Stoics can seem that way because what they are doing, or what they try to do, what we try to do, is use our hegemonicon, another word for our rational faculties, our brain, to determine whether or not these emotions we're having, these feelings we're having, these impressions we have, is what they're called in Stoicism, an impression of a certain scenario, whether it's logical to assent to an emotion based on that impression. And so that means that we tend not to be reactionary, other than in those cases where I said somebody jumps out and scares us.
Right. Huh. Yeah, I'm glad you made the distinction between capital S Stoicism and lowercase s Stoicism. And personally, just in my development and sort of the work I've done on myself in my life, I mean, one of the ways I described my dad was as stoic, and it wasn't that he was like sober as a judge or anything like that. He had a sense of humor and all that, but what he was numb to a lot of his emotions. You saw anger, but that was about it. And now, I understand a lot better why he was that way. But, in my world, to describe someone as stoic isn't really a good thing, but what I see a lot online in these, from these guys out there who they want to advocate for men or tell men how to be men or define what masculinity is or whatever, people refer to, to be masculine is to be stoic as it pertains to emotions.
No, as it pertains to your roles. And this goes for women as well. Stoicism is not a strictly male philosophy, not in any capacity. To drive this home, Stoicism's main claim, which separates it from other, let's say, Aristotelianism or capital C cynicism, the main thing that separates it is that it says virtue isn't just a good. It isn't the best good, the highest good. It's the only good. So the entire purpose of Stoicism is to obtain virtue, to develop a virtuous character. People will refer to this as flourishing through eudaimonia or eudaimonia, depending on how you prefer to pronounce and spell that. They may also refer to it as arete, or living in excellence. Again, very little to do with men, very little to do with women, having to do with human beings. And to drive home just how extreme they feel about this, because this is another big misconception about Stoicism, is the word indifference. Because the Stoics don't spell the word indifference the way that most people hear that word being spelled when they hear it. If something is not virtue, and it is not vice, and in Stoicism, vice is the only bad, if it's not either one of those things, it is an indifferent thing. And the plural of indifferent is ENTS, indifference. And so there's a confusion that Stoics feel indifferently about all of the world, that it doesn't matter. That's not true. But there's some language in Stoicism that can be really upsetting to somebody who doesn't understand this difference, because when something is an indifferent, what the Stoics mean is it has no direct ability to impact our ability to develop our character. Only we can make that decision. We have control over our thoughts, attitudes, and actions, and as I said before, some of our emotions. So you can hear a Stoic say, well, slavery or world peace, those are indifference. And people hear that and they say, what? The Stoics think that world peace doesn't matter? Well, that's not what any Stoic has ever said. Or they say that that slavery is not bad, or it doesn't matter that we get rid of it. Nope, that's not. It's a language problem. There's a lot of language problems when you're dealing with, a philosophy that started in Greek and then was made Latin and then became English. Like, of course, there's going to be a lot of things lost in translation, but that's one of the biggest ones. And so the whole purpose of Stoicism, as I've said before, is to develop a virtuous character. And you look at all other things as being indifferent in its impact or their impact on your ability to build that character. Now, that doesn't mean those things don't matter. In fact, a Stoic would say that if you didn't, in almost all cases, because Stoicism is extremely contextual based on situation, if you didn't work to bring about world peace, or you didn't work to abolish slavery, that would say something negative about your character. It would say something vicious about you. And so a Stoic would work to abolish slavery, even though they identified it as an indifferent in its impact on an individual's ability to develop a virtuous character. Epictetus, one of the most popular, most famous, well-known Stoics, we still read his text today in colleges, universities, he's on bookshelves all over the world. He was himself a slave before he became a philosopher. So the idea is our external situations cannot make us anything. You could push me and you can make me move, but you can't make me hate you. You can't make me hate myself. You can't make me do evil, unkind things. That is ultimately my decision. Same thing goes for being rich. If you're rich, somebody might think, well, to be wealthy is clearly that's something that you would want because it makes your life so much easier. Well, from the Stoic perspective, if the purpose of life is to develop a virtuous character, being rich probably makes that even more difficult, right? Kai would get mad at me for saying that, but it would seem that difficulty is what gives people the opportunity or the nexus at which to explore their character, to wonder if there might be something about them that they should be improving. Maybe it's their weight, maybe it's their bad attitude, maybe it's any number of things. If you're really wealthy, you may never have an excuse to wonder if you're a good person because you've got everything you could possibly need, front, left, and right, left, and center, whatever the saying is. And there's no reason for you to think that anything needs to change. So indifference are then broken down into two categories, with three technically. The third is kind of like an indifferent, like an indifferent that doesn't matter either way. But then there's a preferred indifferent, and that could be money, and a dispreferred indifferent, and that could be slavery. So I'll give you examples in opposite of both of those, because I said a dispreferred indifferent would usually be slavery. And I said usually, and people are probably like, what do you mean usually? That's always going to be dispreferred. Well, imagine a situation where you are a single father, your wife has passed away, you and your son live alone in a country where you're very poor, you can barely feed yourselves, and you get the opportunity to go to another country somewhere far away to work for a couple of seasons to make a lot of money. And when you come back, it's going to change you and your son's life forever. But there's a hitch. You can't take your son because there's no room on the plane or the train, or they can't house them there, or for whatever reason. It's a thought experiment, right? And so you go to your friend and you say, and your friend maybe owns a cocoa farm or a palm oil farm or whatever. And he says, well, look, I can take your son in. I can't pay him. I can feed him, but to be able to feed him, he's going to have to work for me. And that is slavery of a kind, indentured servitude, I think we would probably call it. So in that case, being that if you don't allow your friend who's going to make your son work to do that, if you don't make that decision, then you can't go off and do the thing that's ultimately going to be better for you and your family. And this is all assuming you trust the friend and it's an honest situation, right? So in that case, slavery or indentured servitude would be a preferred indifferent. But usually, in most cases, right? I'm not a crazy person. In most cases, it is a dispreferred indifferent. And then wealth, on the other hand, is, well, that's always a preferred indifferent. Well, okay, what if you're somebody who's struggling with a gambling addiction and you're in Vegas And if you have money, you're probably going to do something kind of stupid. So maybe having money in that situation is a dispreferred indifferent. So everything that doesn't affect our character is an indifferent. We break it down into those two primary categories. There's a third one, but I don't really need to go into it because it's kind of like the one that doesn't matter. And Kai would yell at me for that too. But dispreferred and preferred, and
neutral is the word that keeps coming to mind.
Right, neutral. And you can chase wealth so long as it does not move you further from virtue and closer to vice. So if you can be a billionaire, nothing wrong with being a billionaire, but you know what is wrong with being not being a billionaire, but you know what would be wrong, what would be vicious in that case? Stoics are cosmopolitans. They believe in the world city. I mentioned it before. And they believe something that you would think came straight out of Marx, right? Which wasn't until many centuries later. And that is that the more means you have, the greater responsibility you have to the cosmopolis in your society. So when the Broics start diving into Stoicism and they find that, they really don't like it because the Broics generally find that to be an offensive idea. And I'm not saying either way. I'm not a fan of Marx in general, but that is true of Stoicism. And so what would be bad about being a billionaire would be if you had your billions of dollars and you didn't increase your responsibility to the cosmopolis. You didn't use your fortunate position to make the world city a better place. So you can be a billionaire and be a really great guy or lady, but you could also be pretty terrible. and that's really what it comes down to, is the actions you take given your contextual situations and what those actions, thoughts, or attitudes reflect about your character. That's what it's all about.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to explain all this to me, and really what's interesting to me is that I was looking for the book you're describing. I mean, I hadn't started to look for it yet, but I, was interested in obtaining the type of book that you've written. So I'm excited to see it. There you go. Come back next week for part 2 with Tanner. Please follow the show. And if you enjoyed the episode, please leave a rating or a review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We'll be back next week with more of Tanner. Thanks for listening. Be nice.
You did great, honey.